Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I am your host, Niels Eichhorn, and even though we're recording this almost at Easter, we're probably not going to hear this out to the public until early mid-May, but in many ways, I'm going back today to my old stomping grounds in Georgia and potentially future stomping grounds if I finally get that book with UGA Press done. So we are going to the coast of Georgia today to talk to Paul M. Presley. He is a fascinating individual with a Master's of Public Administration from Harvard, a PhD in history from Oxford, and as he told me as we were chatting before, he had been in Beirut at an American university for a few years before he came in 1981 to Savannah to take on a role at a private school there. And upon retirement, this is probably where most people are interested in, he became the director of the Ossabaw Island Foundation, which will probably pop up a few times during our conversation today. Now, I remember Paul's work because I assigned a long time ago his On the Rim of the Caribbean, which is the history of Georgia during the American Revolution. But he has also published African American Life in the Georgia Lowcountry, Coastal Nature and Coastal Culture, and the one that we are going to talk about, his newest book, A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country. And I should say, all of which I have mentioned so far is published by the University of Georgia Press. So, Paul, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast and taking the time to talk about your really interesting new book.
Niels, thank you for this opportunity. I am looking forward to it. I'm fascinated by your background and by the ways that we have crossed paths, so to speak, metaphorically at least, in Georgia.
Yeah, I know. It is a great scholarly ground to walk on. And so let's just since you have to be somewhere later today, let's dive right in and tell us a little bit about how you decided to write a history about runaway slaves and escaped enslaved people in late colonial and early national Georgia.
Good. Well, let me just say, first of all, I was director of the Education Alliance on the Ossabaw Island thing with the Board of Regents and the Department of Natural Resources. And when I was asked to tell the story of enslaved people in tabby cabins that still exist on the island, and from that, uh, I decided to hold a symposium on African American life with top historians, Philip D. Morgan, Jacqueline Jones, people of that nature. It was a big success, a great book. I was assistant editor of that. And that inspired me to write this book that you mentioned, um, on the rim of the Caribbean, colonial Georgia and the British Atlantic world. And what fascinated me about that was Savannah in that period, 1750, 1775, was really a Caribbean town.
Mm.
Wasn't something that was looking so much to London as people in Savannah or Georgia like to think about. It was looking to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, Barbados, Montserrat, Antigua. And I was impressed by the number of sailors, black sailors, coming up on the wharf and really dominating the waterfront. And a lot of stories came up, and that led to this book. Uh, it got me interested in what's happening with the movement of Black people on the coast of Georgia with the Caribbean and with the rest of the world. So that I published an article on one person who came from Ossabaw, a man named Titus.
Mm.
He led 28 enslaved people after the Revolution to Spanish Florida, and so that became an article in the Journal of Southern History, and then that became a book.
Mm. Wow. That was almost counterclimactic where I was like, ooh, expecting almost more, but no, that's amazing, right? Of like that one story that you find that then just he wants a context to all of it. And
Well, Neil said there is a lot more to it. I'm just narrowing it
yeah,
down.
I know.
It's you start doing the research, and what
Hmm.
happened. The story of Titus is absolutely fascinating, the most fascinating in the book. But the fact is, I became aware of an enormous movement of Africans and African Americans throughout the Southeast Georgia, um, and throughout the Southeast, and
Hmm.
the importance of Caribbean areas. And it wasn't just a one-way street out, it was a two-way street. And a
Hmm.
number of enslaved people were brought back, a number who were carried to Spanish Florida by planters
Hmm.
escaped back to rejoin their families. So there's just this constant movement. And what you're talking about is you're really studying a borderland.
Hmm. And a lot of people forget that, right? That Georgia is a borderland for most of the colonial period because right across the river is Spanish territory. And it or once like well, Britain takes over Florida for a little while, but it is it's a very contentious area because for so many years in the 1700s you have constant conflicts between Britain and Spain on opposite sides. So it is an incredible volatile region.
Absolutely. And it goes back to something I think is just inherent in the way American history is taught. We
Mm.
always are looking to west. We're looking at
Hmm.
westward expansion. We're looking at manifest destiny. And
Hmm.
the reality is you've got to also look south. And that brings Spanish Florida, it brings the Gulf Coast up. And it's being rediscovered. There's some wonderful books that have been published in the last 10 years. Uh, but I'm happy to be part of that sort of exploration and remembering that Spanish Florida is part of the Caribbean.
Yeah, yeah, and but I want to circle back a little bit to your article on Titus because one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, and I think a lot of readers will greatly enjoy about your book, is that you centered each of your chapters around people. There's always this main character that you kind of single out, tells a story, and then you put the context around it. So was that like was that something you decided that when you wrote the article on Titus, or was that something in the crafting framing of the books that you decided? Like how did that go for you?
It's sort of interesting. I was always trying to do something with individuals
Hmm.
because in the process of all this 10 years of research, I was picking up wonderful characters, wonderful people who had aspirations and strengths and weaknesses. And when they made a decision, you begin to understand and put it together. Um, but I wanted Titus. Um, there was so much there that I realized, okay, so I went to a seminar during the pandemic, and it was a Omohodro Institute seminar.
Hmm.
A little tiny thing. It was by competition. There were 12 people, and it was a wonderful person, um, Peter Simon Newman, who superintended it. And he said, we read each other 10 pages of paper. And I read mine, and it was something else. It wasn't about Titus, because that was good. And it was not good. And they said, wait a minute, you need to be emphasizing individuals. You've got something going. You need to spend less time on geopolitics and more
Hmm.
on individuals. So I went back and really kind of reworked what I
Hmm.
was doing. And Niels, the issue for me is how do you create the life of a person who's just simply left a trace in the historical record?
Hmm.
What's the role of historical imagination? Got to be careful on that. But there is a role, and you want to accumulate as many points, any data points, as they now say, as you possibly can. So it's like putting together a jigsaw puzzle with several thousand pieces for each person. Mm.
Oh, I totally understand. Like that's exactly right. That I was going to ask you about that a little bit later on too. Of course, it's like you're you're writing the story of people that are kept uneducated, right? That are kept from reading and writing on purpose, and you're wanting to tell their story, and you can't tell their story if there's no written records. And it so reminds me for like listeners that have been with me for a while, like Freedom's Mirage, Sidney Nason, he wrote this beautiful book about Virgil Banaham out of Plantation in Raleigh. And like there's a lot of inferring simply because you don't know every piece and you have to make sort of educated guesses.
Sure, sure.
So how did you go about that? Were there like was any of your characters like I didn't pick up on it in the books, that's why I'm kind of curious. Was there any kind of moment where you kind of were like, I really would have liked to know more. I really would have liked to get the smoking gun document on them.
Mohammed, who's really Mohammed.
Yeah.
That's in my second chapter. In Mohammed, his career extended across that of pre-revolutionary Georgia, the revolution, and the immediate post-revolutionary period.
Mhm.
Comes from the Senegambia River. We know exactly what happened on the Senegambia River, which is extraordinary. And that's thanks to the research of one historian. Then we can trace him on the Savannah River rice plantation because of notices in the Georgia Gazette. And as we know that he was in a maroon. Then he's taken to Florida after the revolution, brought up to Beaufort and sold because that was where the highest price was.
Mhm.
He goes to this probably one of the largest maroon communities in the history of the United States on Bear Creek Island. Um, Fabulous thing, the only maroon community that used military tactics. The question is trying to figure out how Muhammad, he died there fighting the Georgia State Militia. I would just love to interview him right before that battle. I just,
Yeah.
there was several decisions that were made that were not wise that sort of opened them
Hmm.
up to the Georgia State Militia and the South Carolina State Militia. Uh,
Yeah. No, that he's one character that was just stand out in so many regards, right? And you could almost sense in your writing how you kind of were like on the shoulder of these guys going like, no, don't bring them back. Don't bring them here. Don't kind of violate the pinnacle rule of your community.
and the other thing about Muhammad is that he was Muslim.
Hmm.
He probably was literate, unlike or at least semi-literate. He may have and probably did try to pray at some point each day, maybe 5 times, but probably not. Um, he probably did not drink, but he wasn't by himself. We know
Hmm.
there was at least one other Muslim in that group that came from the John Graham plantation on the Savannah River down to Florida. They ended up with him on Bear Creek Island, Fatima or Fatima. Um, and you want to know more about Muslim society and how they operate on the
Hmm.
coast. There's been great research because there was a strong Muslim population, but it really
Hmm.
comes from a later period, 19th century.
Hmm. And that's like always fascinating, right? Like especially in light of contemporary events where you're kind of like the hatred on some level almost towards people, Muslim Islamic people, and you're kind of like when you look at like the history of the United States, it's right there. Like they're here since the very start, and I guess it's because the textbooks just don't talk about that.
I know it. Well, what's frustrating for me is I'm going back to the planners who
Hmm.
recorded these people and how unobservant they were. I mean, they were business people.
Yeah,
They were good business people.
yeah.
Uh, they weren't living a life of luxury. Well, they actually did live a life of luxury, but they were hard workers. But it was a very narrow focus and very cruel.
No, yeah. And they didn't care what religion you were, right? As long as you got the work done at the end of the day. That's all they cared about. Um, Before we get any deeper, though, because we already have a couple of your characters in uh, talked about here. So I want to briefly talk about the concept that you're tackling here, which is, and you put it on the title of your book, Underground Railroad, right? And it's like most of the listeners here would be like, "Oh yeah, we're going to take somebody from Kentucky to Canada or from Maryland to Canada," and like that's not what you're doing. So, what I guess the question should be, how much did you pick the title? How much did the title sort of naturally emerge?
Well, that I went through. I did a presentation at the University of Georgia recently with Nate Holly, who is my editor, and he asked me the question. Paul, tell us about the quest to find a title for your book.
Oh.
There probably were seven changes, and this only emerged at the end because what I was interested in is movement, and there's
Hmm.
such massive amount of movement over 40 years that this is sort of like what happened 30 years later,
Hmm.
or it's like what happened during the revolution. And yes, I admit this is a grand metaphor, nothing more than that. There's striking differences. Uh, but what I look at on approach it this way when I'm explaining this to people. You've got to think of two mountains and a small hill. And the first little small mountain is the American Revolution. 20 to 30,000 African Americans escaped from slavery and make it to British lines, about 8,000 of whom fought for the British. And then in the history books, you read just sort of a flat line and
Hmm.
nothing's happening until the late 1830s,
Hmm.
1840s, 1850s. And at the top of that mountain, you have Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. So this valley in here,
Hmm.
I'm trying to demonstrate is not a valley.
Hmm.
If there were probably between 30 to 60,000, nobody knows, making it up, not making it up, but the estimates range between 30 to 60,000. I'm estimating between 3 and 5,000 people escaped during this 40-year period. And it was perhaps an arc of liberty that connects one period with the other period.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of thinking about it. And it is such an unusual place to think about it, but then at the same time not, because when you think Georgia, we have the crafts, right? That
Yeah,
make it out in sort of an underground railroad fashion. So why not earlier people too?
exactly, exactly.
So how do
Uh,
you like you kind of mentioned earlier like one of your earlier chapters had like this or like one of your earlier drafts and ideas that you played with had like a lot of geopolitics and obviously that matters considering Spain, Britain, the United States, sort of the rivalries here. But considering, and we both know the Georgia coastline with all its little islands and inland waterways, how much does the coastal environment of Georgia lend itself also to kind of this movement of, let me step back, this illicit movement of people trying to get away from slavery?
yeah, it's absolutely fundamental because it's water, it's salt
Hmm.
water. That is the key to escape. And most of these people on the coast of Georgia, you could find with any one group, you could find a skilled waterman or water person. And it's fascinating to see the mechanism by these how these escapes worked. And people think when you look about the Underground Railroad in the traditional period, you're talking about one or two people. You're not talking about large groups of people. Now there are help, there's networks, there are free blacks, there's self-emancipation, there are abolitionists and Quakers and so on. Uh, but finding that blacks sort of freed themselves as well. But in the South, in this period of time, they're going by water. And I'll give you one example. Liberty County, that we all know so well, um, where Sunbury used to be the capital, 16 people boarded a schooner with clothing, with food, with a rifle. Uh, they had planned this out. They had probably planned for months on how to do this. They looked at the tides and they got in that schooner and they broke off. And these um, people began to sail down towards Amelia Island. That's where they wanted to make it. Unfortunately for them, the planter got word very quickly, and he loaded up another schooner with fellow people with rifles shot with muskets, and they took off after them. They caught up around the Crooked River, and when the African Americans saw that things were not going their way, they grounded the boat and dashed into the marsh,
Mm-hmm.
and with the white people following them. 13 were captured, but three people laid low, and they stole a little canoe that they found and made it to Amelia Island and gained their freedom. And that really is sort of, to me, a metaphor of what's going on here. Rarely was it a schooner. It usually was canoes,
Mm-hmm.
cypress canoes, but they were fairly substantial.
Mm-hmm.
And there would be three, four, five, six people in them.
Yeah, and I think the part that is important too of what you're saying is that this is even though like today we look at right the newspaper and it's like planter announces like 5 people ran away or 10 people ran away and we're searching for some. It gives us a glimpse of like the after, but we don't see like the planning and how much work they're investing in that.
And part of that planning of this, stop and think about it, because these people were leaving communities where they'd been in
Hmm.
for some time.
Right.
And, the large communities, rice plantations, where you
Hmm.
had 150 people, um, they were breaking away and they were going to an area where there was another language,
Hmm.
there was another culture, there were other traditions. It was an enormous break.
Hmm.
So what's going on in their minds? And of course, what I found is that once they crossed the St. Mary's River, where this tremendous vacuum of power existed,
Hmm.
make choices.
Yeah, and I think it was Mahmoud that where you kind of really kind of also see like the challenge of family ties that
Yeah,
if you have family you don't want to leave them and
yeah, yeah,
you're kind of staying in close proximity.
yeah,
So
yeah.
go ahead.
Exactly. No, I mean, I'm thinking again of the case of Hercules and Betty. And Hercules
Mm,
was brought to the Morel plantation on Ossabaw. Again, this is one of the original stories
mm,
that have got me involved in the whole book. Um, he was brought in the 1760s. He was
mm,
from Angola, which of course is a huge area and hundreds of different languages and so
mm,
on, cultures. But he marries Betty. And who is Betty? Betty is from Augusta, Georgia.
mm,
Morrell, when he originally brought in 59 people for his plantation, did not go to West Africa,
mm,
did not go to the Caribbean.
mm,
He bought the estate of a deerskin merchant. And what he
mm,
got from that estate was these were families.
mhm,
Uh, Betty was part of a family of I think 5 people, and there was one family that was 7 people. These were very stable. So Hercules and Betty came together, and he brought some real skill as a waterman. So that they made that decision. And of course, I'm fascinated with Betty and Hercules for another reason, is that when they went to Florida, they went in a yawl,
mhm,
which is meant for harbor, with 9 people and 20-foot boat. I used to have a big high-powered runabout, 22 feet,
mhm,
uh, with 200 horsepower engine, and I once had 7 people in it, eight of us all together, and we got caught in some heavy water, and it was scary. I
mhm.
just, with thinking of a yawl with 9 people in it, 20 feet. I don't see how they made it for 120 miles, but they did.
Somebody
But
protected some.
but at the end of it, Betty and Hercules and their 2 children,
Mm,
children are a very important part of the escapes. The
right.
2 children decided to stay with Colonel Thomas Brown of the British.
Mm,
Apparently, Hercules had fought with him. We'll get back to that later at the siege of Savannah. And Jupiter and Oba and their 2 children head to the Seminoles.
Hmm.
I would love to be sit down and listen to their discussion as they were coming down the coast.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it, right? There's so many where you're kind of like you just want to sit down with them and interview them because they have so many things to say and tell you that you just can't find anywhere else.
Yeah.
Yeah, it also kind of like that. I'm kind of thinking of the family ties because you had like I think it was Titus of like circling, right? Like around that area where his family and his old plantation was, and it's just sort of this arc you describe where he goes back and forth and he's marooning and surviving, um, within close proximity to all these plantations.
But it has, Niels, it has a real comment. I mean, Titus's career, a real comment on marronage and
Hmm.
what does it mean to be a Maroon,
Yeah.
because he had three different Maroon communities that he created over his 12-year
Hmm.
span, and each of those communities had a different composition.
Yeah.
See, he fled to Florida in 1789 and was a Maroon for 3 years, and he was with three or four of his friends, his copains. Um, and he was known as an outlaw. He was not popular. Apparently, they raided for food, a little bit of a disturbance. He was captured and brought back to Ossabaw Island under John Morrell, and 3 months later, he escapes. And then he sets up what I call a maroon community, and that he has a canoe, and he goes up the Ogeechee River, comes back, then up the Savannah River. Over 3 years, he's just constantly moving, and apparently seems to have been quite a popular figure, respected figure among the enslaved people who fed him and kept him.
Yeah.
And only when he discovered that his family was about to be sold on Ossabaw, he came back and organized an expedition in two canoes, 15 people, to go to Amelia Island. So that was a whole family thing with women and children involved. They're captured. He spends 2 years in the Castillo de San Marcos. And then when he escapes, now how many people do you know that escape from the Castillo de San Marcos? For those who walk through that dungeon is pretty secure. But anyway, he escaped.
I've been there. It's pretty sort of strong walls and pretty high parapets.
Made with coquina shells, and it's meant to withstand. It was never taken. It was besieged 3 times, never taken. But if I had been Titus, I would have
Mhm.
gone towards the Seminoles, which he could have done very easily
Yeah.
when he escaped. He did not. He went back to Georgia. He
Hmm.
picked up, before he left Florida, he picked up at least two and probably three or four people that followed him.
Hmm.
And he set up a maroon community right outside Savannah. We don't know exactly where. And see, at that point, now this is where I begin to be able to interpret his thinking. He's lost a sense of caution. He's
Hmm.
angry. He's mad. He's been done wrong. He'd
Yeah.
been married, child, all of this has been taken away from him.
Mhm.
So he really accepts any other Maroons that are coming out of hiding to his place, and he
Mhm.
accepts enslaved people that are escaping. And of course, you know what happens. The state militia organizes and comes in. There's a gun battle, a firefight. They're dead, but he's not captured. And then he disappears. So what happened to him? We don't know. And I still go into the archives and think maybe someday I found a little piece of paper.
Yeah. Yeah. It is crazy when you have that story you want to bring to a close and figure out like that person you have been so attached to, like what happened to them and can't
But
find it.
there's, but there's something bigger than all of this that's going
Yeah.
through that underwrites this. And I
Mhm.
think gives added significance to the book because it's a vacuum of power,
Yeah.
because you have these dozens and eventually hundreds and then several thousand people moving back and
Mhm.
forth. Um, it affects the balance of power in the
Mhm.
Southeast. And of course, that comes with, you see that with William Augustus Bowles,
Mhm.
with the assistance they gave him in 1800. You see that with the Patriot War and the Creek War and the War of 1812. Um, the Black Militia of St. Augustine the black Seminoles for the Seminoles actually take a significant part in the conflict. So there's something more than just individual stories, balance and
Mhm.
power.
Yeah. But, I mean, obviously, when you wrote the book, it wasn't on your mind. But when I read the book now in the last months, I, of course, saw the news of like people getting moved to El Salvadoran prisons and individuals losing their green cards and student visas being revoked. It's like it's like you read the book with like we read the books with what we then have as our context of time that you didn't anticipate when you wrote it, but it's like there's so much there that you also then can connect of like this forceful migration across a border, right? Or the like seeking refuge on one side or the other side of the border from whatever reasoning it might be, and trying to find allies, whether that is Native American or Spanish authorities. So felt rings very contemporary in a 2025 context.
Absolutely. The whole question of movement of migrants and others is very much here. Many parallels, as you point out.
Yeah, but as I said, we also know that that was not something you were like, oh, I'm going to write a book that will 5 years from now have that relevance.
No, again, it was pursuing
Yeah,
a problem, and that
yeah.
problem, I think I've just opened a door, and I'm hoping other
Hmm.
historians walk through. Some marvelous work has been done. It's not like I've
Yeah.
opened the door.
Mm-hmm.
There's several doors there, and people are finding there is more material. And see, I've included things such as the War of 1812, when
Hmm.
the British occupy Cumberland Island and briefly St. Simon's Island, and you have 1,400 people
Hmm.
accept the British peace and leave. And you actually have enslaved Georgians that were in Florida that came back to Cumberland Island and gained their freedom.
Yeah. No, it's that was very fascinating too. But let's not get too far ahead because we also have still the revolution
Okay.
that we should talk about briefly because the revolution is a major moment because you have the revolutionary United States, you have the British, you have the Spanish that are all interacting here with one another. And from a enslaved perspective, it was even more fascinating because you have like um what was it? You have British and rolling enslaved people in the defense of Savannah. And then the French bring Haitians, black Haitians, up to fight in this as well.
This story is now being told. I mean, has been one of the best, not a secret. Nobody really realized it until the hard research was done. But there have been two or three book works that have come out in the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 years that
Mhm.
have shown that between 600 and 800 African Americans fought for the British in the siege of Savannah in 1779. That the best estimate is about 10% of the British forces were black. And most of them were enslaved. Most of them
Mhm.
did not get their freedom, contrary to in other places, locations on the East Coast. Um, Hercules
Mhm.
is one of those examples. It's circumstantial evidence in his case, but he was held on Ossabaw. The revolution made absolutely no difference in his life, except in one respect, from 1776 to 17 December 27th, 1778. No difference, except he was part of the boats that slipped down the coast to British St. Augustine. Now,
Mhm.
keep in mind, as you pointed out, the British occupied Florida from between 1763 and 1783. Just that little 20-year blip that won't go into all the reasons why that was kind of a hiccup, maybe more than a hiccup. But he was smuggling bars of indigo. And of
Mhm.
course, it was the overseer that was taking the boat or canoe down. So he knew the waterway there. He picked that up, but had to stay on that island. And all of a sudden, when the British occupied Savannah, uh, January 1779, he still had to stay on the Ossabaw Island. You know, he had to go crazy because hundreds of Africans were coming into Savannah, and they were being used by the British to sort of their supplies, to wash their clothes, and also to be militia, to be soldiers. Uh, but in September, a French fleet was seen. It was known that there was going to be a counterattack, so maybe a little bit before September. That's when they brought Hercules and 29 other people off Ossabaw and equipped them. Of course, what makes him decide that taste of freedom? You land on the dock, you see all the supplies, you see all the weapons, you hear the talks of we're fighting for freedom
Mhm.
from the British perspective. That's what they were fighting for. And he participates, he fires at the Americans. And what happens? 2 months after the battle, he's sent back to Ossabaw. And of course, it was just a matter of time before he fled.
No, I mean that's exactly it, right? That if you are giving that taste, why would you not take that opportunity? So I found it very interesting, and I think it's you can correct me on this one. I think it's Johnson Square in Savannah, where they actually have a
Yes.
monument to, but there's no monument. Like we have a monument to French soldiers, French Afro-Caribbean soldiers who come and fight, but we don't have one for the British African soldiers who fought in the Revolution in Savannah.
Yeah, it's not Johnson Square. It's slipping my mind. It's for the west, in front of First African Baptist Church, which was arguably the first church anyway. Um, it was done very nicely, but there
Oh,
is no
Franklin Square. Franklin Square.
Franklin
Franklin.
Square. Franklin Square. Thank you for that. How did you see that so quickly?
I have a map open.
Okay,
I cheated.
okay. Franklin Square. No, there's nothing to celebrate the British. In fact, going back to your original point, which I've not answered, you have French blacks, and you have in former anyway British African Americans fighting. They're not really fighting each other. I mean, they are fighting each other, but they don't. They're not aware of it. Uh, the, the French do not treat that little company with respect. They just put them digging ditches. Uh, Christophe was about 19 years old. He's digging a ditch. Who knew? Uh,
Well, if you look at the monument, you wouldn't, because they're all holding guns.
exactly, but they weren't. That's the anyway. But it's fine. The other thing is, when my mind blanked out on what the other thing is about the Hercules and his group. Well, never mind.
There's something for Savannah to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like it is kind of as a sidebar. I find it very interesting in how Savannah always presents itself as this very historic town. But when it comes to preserving history, it's not always doing a great job.
Well, this was a big controversy. I guess about 12 years ago, there was no monument to recognize slavery, the
Yeah,
introduction of slavery or enslaved people.
right.
So it was the city council finally decided we need to do something. We should do
Mm,
it. And it was an African American mayor.
mhm.
And everybody in the city thought, well, this makes sense. Why
Right.
not? And a distinguished sculpture was brought, and a quote was going to be was inscribed on it from Maya Angelou.
Hmm. Mm, wow.
It was deemed by some people offensive. and, and they and some I forget exactly what happened, but there were some arrangements, and it's not as quite. I think anyway, it's not as powerful a quote as it used to be. Um,
Ah, yeah.
and then you've got the Civil War monument at Forsyth Park, but Savannah has fortunately escaped a little bit escaped the Civil War debate because there are no great lost cause statues in here. It was primarily a monument to the dead. And I
No,
think
that could be a conversation for another day because like
Yeah.
it's interesting when you look at like places like Fort McAllister and like which is right next to us about Island actually and how the when Ford takes over that place in the I think it's 19 teens and how the UDC gets to come in and kind of do all their saying and kind of celebrate their 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 story. Um,
Savannah's got a ways to go. You're absolutely right on this. And I think that what we're proud of is that our museums, our house
mhm.
museums, have caught up or catching up. The
Yeah.
Owens Thomas House, the Ships of the Sea Museum,
Hmm.
those kinds of things are devoting a considerable space and retelling that story and working with archaeologists and on. But the question is, how do you reach the public? Because all
Hmm.
they gonna remember is one thing when they spend 30, 40 minutes with you. And to
Yeah.
get that one thing across is not easy.
No, no, it's not. It, I wish I wish I knew the answer to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, now, because you do have a deadline that you need to be at a meeting at some point or in a less than an hour, so I don't want to make you late. There's one other group we should talk about because this is not about just the story of the imperial conflict and enslaved people using that conflict, but it's also a story of Native Americans.
Yes. Let me back up, Neil, and answer one. Add in one. Just look at a note that I've written here that I want to mention. And the nature of the borderland
Hmm.
and kind of a vacuum of power that existed,
Hmm.
and just talk about the St. Mary's River a second and the two groups on each
Hmm.
side.
Yeah.
So who was on the Spanish side of the St. Mary's River? That's the river that separates Georgia from Florida and
Hmm.
kind of flows around the Okefenokee Swamp. Um, First of all, you had Spanish officials, of course, and then you had British loyalists from Georgia and South Carolina, loyalists.
Hmm.
But basically, they were small farmers. These were not big planters. It were small farmers. And then you had Americans who were planters with enslaved people, but they owed debt,
Hmm.
were trying to escape their creditors who wanted to get a hold of their property. And of course, we all know what their property was. So they were there on the river planting, but with the idea that if they could sort of resolve the issue, they could move back to the United States. So not much loyalty there. And then you had a gracious plenty of cattle thieves and horse thieves. On the American side, you had planters, you had French refugees from Santo Domingo, and it was kind of a colony that came there. Savannah didn't really want the French refugees because they were scared their enslaved people had revolutionary ideas
Right.
and down to the St. Mary's and keep them out of the way.
Hmm.
Um, and then, of course, you had cattle thieves and horse thieves that were working the other side of the river. And coming down the St. Mary's, you had Seminoles to lead back
Hmm.
into where you are, Seminoles, and sometimes Creeks. And
Hmm.
sometimes they came to trade. Sometimes they came to St. Mary's to buy enslaved people. Sometimes they came to raid, but
Hmm.
more often that they would drift down and just hunt,
Hmm.
and sometimes steal a cow
Right.
or something to that effect. But the Spanish and Americans were very nervous about that. Go back to
Yeah.
your question. Hmm.
Yeah, no, it's like exactly right. It's a very contested region, and like the Native Americans matter. That
Yeah.
it is the hinterland is dominated by them, and I found it very interesting of how like if like in part you can read your book as sort of like the case study approach and be like, oh, I'm going to pull one of these cases out and make my students read it in class. But reading sort of the Creek, Muskogee, and the Seminole chapters right back to back was fascinating. Kind of see how different these two groups treated and engaged with African Americans. In the Creek case, it's like, oh, well, we want to be planters, so we're going to use them as slaves, or we trade with the white people to get them to return these enslaved. And then the Seminoles, like it's like, yeah, you're slaves, but whatever.
That's right. You know, this is fascinating. Let me just say very, very quickly, I am not a scholar of indigenous people. That's a weakness of mine. And what I did was to read as much as I could get
Mhm.
involved Greeks and the Seminoles. And of course, on the Seminoles, there's not very much evidence. So you have distinguished scholars debating over the head of a needle, sort of thing. But that's okay too. Um, and I've followed pretty much a main line in my interpretation, but I think I've drilled down and brought up some new information that kind of serves that purpose. And the Seminoles, to me, the most fascinating of all, as you said, Jack Kennard, the half Creek, half Scotsman,
Mhm.
uh, was basically a slave trader who could work both sides of the fence. That is on the Cuyahoga River near the Flint River in southwest Georgia. And he managed a plantation with something like 40 enslaved people, but a herdsman and cattleman. And anyway, he worked with the Americans, he worked with the Spanish, he worked with his comrades of the Creeks. But the Seminoles created a wholly different, not a wholly different, but a substantially different society. First of all, the Seminoles are basically Creeks, not completely. They're a blend of different kind of groups that come, but they're sort of they're called
As a core.
vagabonds and wanderers by the Creeks. The Creeks do not like them because they have key numbers of them, like Kanachi, the leader of the Miccosukee on the Apalachicola River or Lake Miccosukee, has gone out of Georgia downwards, and he was always known as kind of a rebel.
Mhm.
But they come as close as anybody to creating an egalitarian society. Is there, and nobody can quite figure out. You have the black people that come seeking refuge. They settle a village next to the settlement of the Seminoles, and they're given tremendous responsibility. They're allowed to grow what they want. They pay tribute to the chieftain of the Seminole, um, and they can own cattle and they can sell it. But they have been called Maroons. They're not really Maroons because the Seminoles really still considered them enslaved. And historians are trying to untie that dependence
Mhm.
because it's still today in Oklahoma with the black
Mhm.
Seminoles and the red Seminoles, and how you divide up money coming from the federal government in recognition of treaty obligations that were not observed. And they've had two cases reach the Supreme Court. So it's something that was happening back then that continues today.
Yeah, no, and it's the right. It's in many ways sort of the central tragedy of the southeastern tribes that you're getting to as well. Of like here you have the Creek who are just like the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee are like, okay, the white people are not going to remove us and threaten us if we are civilized like white people. And the most civilized way to do this is be planters.
But the Seminoles were very proud people, and
Hmm.
they did not have much in the way of governance in the way the Creeks did, where each town, each settlement among the Seminoles, and only about 2,000, 2,500 in there. But what was the status of these black people? And you've got the interpretation that they were Maroons
Hmm.
because they had their independence, but that isn't quite right. They've been called half slaves,
Hmm.
yet they seem to have more freedom than half slaves. They've been called Christina Snyder, who I think maybe has a good way of sort of navigating around it, calls them junior partners
Hmm.
in this. Well, it's hard to say. There's another, Andrew Frank has come
Hmm.
up with an interpretation. You may know him.
Hmm.
He said, look, this is something that was only going on for about 40 years. What was happening was an assimilation that was
Hmm.
taking place very slowly.
Right.
But the Seminole Wars came and interrupted that assimilation. And the blacks, he thinks, probably would have been assimilated in some way, shape, or form to red society, uh, Native American society. And there's some element of truth in that. So we shall see. But if you could go to any Seminole village or settlement and go to a Negro village, is what the Americans call them, you would find people of different status in that. Some were, in fact, slaves, been purchased in St. Augustine or St. Mary's. You would find some that had fled from Georgia and were absolutely free. And you had others that had some kind of dependent relationship where had special obligations. And there's no way to just sort of disentangle that.
Yeah, no. And I'm trying to think, you had this one story in the book too of, I think it was a small Seminole raiding party, and the runaways actually tried to hide with them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
It's it was a Seminole party. It actually the there were several Seminole parties that came up on the St. Johns River,
hmm,
and one that I did. This is a little bit before what you're talking about. It was about 15 people. It was 10 men and 3 women, maybe a couple of children, and and they said they were just hunting, and they brought in their deer skin and were trading for rum,
hmm,
much to the annoyance of the Spanish military governor, not governor, but officer on that. And, he couldn't control them.
hmm,
Um, Titus escaped from one of those plantations on the St. Johns River. And there was other hunting party, and he had 3 people with him. They
hmm,
made it to that party. The Seminoles were delighted. We want to
hmm,
incorporate you. Happy to have you. But then John McQueen, this American who brought
hmm,
us enslaved people from Georgia, hired a pair of slave hunters who brought out their English hunting dogs. And that becomes very serious. And
hmm,
they went and quickly picked up the trail and found them. And the Seminoles stood up and said, okay, give us some money and you can have them. But the Seminoles refused to sort of just turn them over. The
hmm,
Seminoles brought them back without tying their hands.
hmm. Yes, that
And
was fun.
so there you have Titus standing with his wife and 2 others, and
Hmm,
with surrounded by Seminoles, who knows 3, 4, 5, or 6, and with the overseer and McQueen. And what happens? Titus says, "You'll never take me," and he pulls out a huge knife, a machete kind of thing, and says, "I will gut your stomach out," and takes off running. Um, he's recaptured, and that's when he goes to the Castillo de San Marcos.
hmm. Like I'm impressed where you found those stories.
Well, this goes back to what are the sources, and
Yeah,
at some point you might want me to talk a little bit about sources.
sure. We can very briefly do that.
No, okay. Very briefly, you start off with notices in the
Hmm,
Georgia Gazette or other places, and they're valuable information, as we all know. Then you turn to deeds and
hmm,
indentures, and you're looking through what used to be microfilm and all of that. It's a very slow, painful process. Um, but the key thing was, I know you've done it as well. The key thing was I found, the East Florida papers, the Spanish archives. And the incredible story is 1821, uh, the treaty that turned over Spanish Florida to the United States. It became a territory. The incredible thing was the Spanish did not burn their records. They turned over
hmm.
every single piece, 65,000 pieces of paper, to the Americans. The next most incredible thing was the Americans didn't burn them.
Right,
No great respect or interest in paper, particularly when 80% were in Spanish,
right.
you know, court records and whatnot. But
And
they
how
shipped
many times accidentally something like that burns?
exactly, and they shipped them to Washington, where I'd like to think that Thomas Jefferson had some hand in their preservation. I think there's some such story. But they sat there in the basement of the Library of Congress, which was just a wooden building. And why they didn't burn with the succession of fires, I don't know. but they really were discovered only in the 1960s.
Hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then all of a sudden you have like this amazing record, right? Where you can kind of dig through and probably people are still digging through them and couldn't find new stuff.
Oh, yeah. Oh, there's a lot of still. And the Library of Congress has digitized them,
Okay.
2021. And that is, ooh, you can spend the rest of your life going through these 65,000 documents.
Grad student can do that.
That's right.
We're too far advanced in our careers to do that.
Oh, man.
Oh my. No, that's great. Of course, you probably are looking back and you're like, I should have waited 5 years to write this book and I could have just used a digital search engine.
Well, exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. I have my own stories on that where archives eventually digitize stuff that I bought from them on microfilm. You're like,
Yeah.
man, if I had just waited a few years. So you kind of already said that Titus and Hercules are sort of your like the main characters. Which one of sort of the lesser individuals that you wrote about was the most fascinating to you? Like
Well,
sort of the not the chapter headers, but sort of like the individuals that are surrounding them.
let me just mention one is a set of people, and
Mhm.
it's the black sailors, a group of black
Mhm.
sailors that sailed for Captain Caleb Davis. And this is chapter one.
Mhm.
This is early Georgia. This is Oglethorpe. And it's the fact that they were saying Captain Davis had these men sailing to the Caribbean,
Mhm.
trading in the West Indies, trading Beaufort and Charleston, including Savannah when it
Mhm.
opened up as a new settlement, but also trading with the enemy, St. Augustine, Spanish
Mhm.
Florida,
Right.
because Spanish Florida didn't grow crops. They depended on South Carolina to provide them. And so Carolinian authorities just sort of closed their eyes to it. And in return, they paid Spanish silver.
Mhm.
That Spanish silver floated the economy. So
Mhm.
those black sailors were really part of an extremely important economic commercial connection.
Mhm.
And they were in and out of Savannah. One of them was, one of their group was a woman,
Mhm.
and she became from Beaufort, and she became manager of the store. This is a person that I've fallen in love with. She was the mistress of Captain Caleb Davis. She fell in love, he fell in love with. He made her the manager of the store. She did his books. She counted out his silver. She was the access. Here you have a woman, black
Yeah.
woman, who's the point of access of these 800 colonists with English mercantile goods, trading goods. And Oglethorpe respected this because this man, Caleb Davis, was so valuable.
Mhm.
Davis would go to and spy on St. Augustine, but the Spanish government would have conversations with Davis. He talked a lot, and he would spy on Oglethorpe. So anyway, that's one this woman, and that's those sailors. Another one is Ned Simmons.
Mhm.
The last chapter, and Ned was um, brought from Africa on the Mulberry Grove plantation, and was brought to Cumberland Island by Nathaniel Greene.
Mhm.
And and in 1815, if you remember this story, Ned was Admiral Cockburn landed and said, "You are free to the enslaved people." And he said, "I want to see who would like to fight as a British black colonial marine." And they're very effective, and they were part of burning of Washington. But every one of the enslaved people stepped forward, men.
Mhm.
He was one. He was given a uniform. And
Mhm.
then at the very end, as they were getting ready to sail off, he had gone back. And because of some technical thing of when the treaty was signed, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, was not allowed to get back on the boat. And he remained enslaved until 1862, when he crossed the St. Mary's River to Amelia Island, federal control, and became free at the age of 100.
Jeez.
Now that's, and I would say that story comes from Mary Bullard. She's an archaeologist and a wonderful historian. She dug that out of the archives. Mm, mm.
Was there also one where it's like the guy didn't want to leave and the mother basically stripped him naked and was trying to force him
That's
onto the boat?
I don't understand that. This was, yeah. The admiral had sent a captain on to St. Simon's, and to let people, all the enslaved,
Yeah.
wanted to be free, and hundreds came, and St. Simon's plantations lost it. And I think there was something like three people that remained behind, but one was a young man, and the mother actually took his clothes off and said, "You're going with me." And she walked off, and he stayed. And he stayed. He became a hero with the master.
Yeah, okay,
But
yeah. He must have really hated his mother, I guess, that he didn't want to leave. But I'll
this
have
this
to.
this was the plantation of Pierce Butler. Remember the sale of the enslaved people, the Weeping Times, 1858. Mm.
Oh my, no, that wow. Um, I there it's just amazing how you have all these great stories and these even these little pieces in there that help kind of create that picture of sort of this very fluid environment.
Exactly. The borders were only in the imagination in many cases.
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that the tragedy, for me, was the Seminole Wars, which erased the borderland.
Hmm.
The borderland had its value. Yeah, it was lawless,
Right.
and there were a lot of cattle thieves. There were a lot of thieves of enslaved people on
Hmm.
both sides. But there was a way of life and
Hmm.
openness
Yeah.
that got erased.
Yeah. And then forgotten too. That
Got
this entire region sort of like you said earlier, it's like it we don't talk about it usually in the history courses because it's like we have other things that we have to cover and we forget this sort of
But
really important geopolitical.
let me pay tribute. There are people that are doing a great deal right now. Jane Landers,
Hmm.
who did so much Black society in Spanish Florida in
Hmm.
that second Spanish period, and continues to write. It's just enormous. And there have been two or three other books. Uh, Titles don't pop into my mind right now that thoroughly do a thoroughly good job on this, and chapters in books.
Hmm.
So it's now out and around.
Yeah. Yeah. And I can promise you I will be citing your book quite extensively when I finally get time to work on my Savannah book again. Because that's
Okay.
one of the requests I got. I have to include more African American enslaved history. So your book will be the start on that. Um,
Oh,
but like you said, you do have an appointment soon, so I
yes.
want to give you time to actually go and do all that. And I really appreciate that you took the time today to chat with us about this new book of yours, which I will also remind my audience here, A Southern Underground Railroad, Black Georgians and the Promise of Spanish Florida and Indian Country.
And Niels, I want to compliment you and congratulate you on what you've done. You've actually read the book. You've actually taken notes. You know exactly what you're talking about. These are the best set of questions I've had. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. I try. I enjoy them too. Your book was very enjoyable.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.